Hello, Ritish. Are you able to hear me clearly?
Good afternoon, sir. Yes, sir.
Yeah, very good. Yeah, so we still have about 5 minutes, so we'll wait till the others join. Are you a student at Ayuka?
No, sir. So I'm from Central University, Himachal Pradesh.
Okay, good, good. Are you people able to see my screen?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, let me make sure it's full screen. Yeah, yeah. Okay. So I think it's 11:30. We can begin. Right. So welcome to this course. It's a 14 lecture course. It's called, official title is Extragalactic Astronomy 2, but really the course is all about AGNs. My name is Yogesh Vardekar. I'm a faculty member at NCRA TIFR. I work partially on AGNs, mostly in the radio, but by no means is all my research about AGNs. I also work on normal galaxies. So I've already set up a website which will be used to interact with you for this course. You may want to just write down the URL that is on your screen. And if you need to contact me for any reason, feel free to email me at this email address, which is given here. And on the website, I will put up the PDF file for each lecture as soon as it's given. So you don't have to bother copying down stuff that is already on the slide. So pay attention to the content of the slide. Don't spend time trying to copy figures or trying to copy the text. The website is already active, so you can go take a look at it. And I'm also going to be recording each of my talks, because I thought that given the whole uncertain situation right now, in case any of you misses a lecture, you'll be able to go to the recording of the lecture and take a look. The recording is being done on the cloud, so it will take a couple of days for me to get the recording and put the recording link on the web page, but it'll be there. Okay. So before we get started, I would just like to do one round of introductions, just stating your name, where you are from, okay, and where you did your previous degree, very likely a master's degree. In some cases, a 4-year BTech is possible, and whether you are a student of IUCAA, NCRA, or one of the universities. So the way to handle it, I think what I should do is, there are 15 participants. I'll just call upon you one by one, and so that we don't get too many people talking at the same time, in the order that I see it on my screen. Okay, so the first name I see is Vishwanath Malakar. So can you unmute yourself and just introduce yourself quickly?
Sir, I'm Vishwanath Malakar. I am from IUCAA.
You are from IUCAA. Okay, and where did you do your previous degree?
Yes, I did my MSc from IIT Kharagpur and BSc from Kalyan University, West Bengal.
Okay, right. Okay, so the next name I see is Ishita Banerjee.
Hello, sir. I'm from Bengal, and
Yeah.
I also in IUCAA.
Okay.
And I did my MSc from KGP, IIT KGP, and from my BS, I did my BSc from Bengal as well, Calcutta University.
Okay, right. So you have a similar profile to Vishwanath. Okay, next name I see is Janmejay Sarkar.
Hello, sir.
Yeah.
I'm from Siliguri in West Bengal. I did my master's from Tezpur University in Assam and my bachelor's from North Bengal University, Assam.
Okay.
North Bengal University in West Bengal, and I'm doing my PhD at Tezpur University in Assam now.
Okay. So you are a university student.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Yeah, I've been to Tezpur many years ago. Would like to go there again, hopefully soon. Okay. Next name I see is Manish.
Hello, sir.
Hmm.
Sir, I have done my BTech from Delhi College of Engineering.
Okay.
and I'm from Delhi as
Okay.
well.
Okay. And so you've done a 4-year course. So you're allowed to direct. Are you doing an integrated course here or
No, I'm allowed in full-time PhD.
full-time PhD? Okay, right. And you are at Ayuka now.
Yes.
Okay, right, Manish. The next name I see is Pushpak Pandey. So Pushpak,
Hello, sir.
yeah.
Yes, sir. I am from Odisha and I have done my integrated MSc from Nizer, Bhubaneswar.
Okay.
And I am an ICO student. I am a PhD.
Yes. So you finished your integrated MSc from Nizer.
Yes, sir.
Okay, great. Okay, so Pushpak, next name I see is Rahul.
Hello, sir. This
Yeah.
is Rahul Sharan. I am currently in NCRA.
Okay.
I took my BSMS from Mysore, Kolkata.
Okay. And where are you originally from? What's your hometown?
Hometown is in my parents are staying in Durgapur, which is in West Bengal. But
Yes.
I'm currently I'm from Bihar.
Now, next name I see is Rajendra Prasad Bhatt.
Yes. Hello, sir. My name is Rajan Sadhar. I am from Kaladongi, which is in Nainital district of Uttarakhand.
Okay.
And I did my MSc from IIT Kharagpur, West Bengal. And I am a student of Ayuka.
Ayuka. Okay. Right. Next name is Ramananda.
Hello,
Yes.
my name is Ramananda Satra and I am an integrated PhD student at NCRA.
Yes.
And I am from West Bengal. So I did my BSc from Vidyasagar University, West Bengal.
Okay. And you did your masters here, right?
No, actually I am integrated PhD. So
Yes. So
I
yeah, I mean, you did your coursework in the Pune University.
yeah, Pune University.
Yes. Okay. Great, Raman. Okay. Now, the next name I see is Ritish Bharadwaj. Ritish, can you please unmute yourself and introduce yourself?
Hello, good afternoon, sir.
Yeah.
So myself, Ritish Kumar. I am from Himachal Pradesh.
Hmm.
I have done my master's from Himachal Pradesh University, Shimla.
Mhm.
And presently I'm a PhD student at Central University, Himachal Pradesh.
Okay. Where is the Central University in Himachal Pradesh located? Which town?
So it's located in Kangra Dharamshala.
Okay. It's in Kangra.
Yes, sir.
Right. We finished with Ritish. Shayok Datta.
Hello, sir. Good afternoon. I'm Shayok. I'm from Bengal. I have done my master's from IIT Guwahati, and I'm right now in Ayuka, PhD student at Ayuka.
Okay. Right. Okay. Next name I see is Soham Day. Soham I know, of course, but anyway, you should introduce yourself.
Hello, sir. I am from West Bengal.
Hmm.
I am an integrated PhD student in NCRA, and I have done my BSc from St. Xavier's College, Kolkata.
Okay. St. Xavier's. Okay. I see Shomil Maulik.
Hi, sir. I'm Somil. I'm from Pune. I did my master's from BITS Goa. I'm currently a PhD student at Ayuka.
So BITS, does it have some kind of integrated masters or?
Yes, it's similar to that. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Great. Okay. So next name I see is Swarnim Shirke.
Hello, sir.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm Swarnim Shirke. I'm from Pune. I did my master's from IIT Bombay, and I'm a student of Ayuka.
Okay. Last name is Yash.
Hello, sir. I'm from Maharashtra. I'm currently at NCRA and I did my BTech from IIT Madras.
Okay. Yeah, I think, were you in engineering physics?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Great. Good. So have I missed out anyone? Because I just went in the order that I saw. Is there anyone here who hasn't introduced themselves yet? Please unmute and speak. Otherwise, we'll continue. Okay, so, right. So here is how your assessment for this course will be done. We will have 2 assignments, which will have about 60% weightage. I'll give you the first assignment more or less at the end of the 3rd week, and the second assignment at the end of the 6th week. And you will have about 2.5 weeks time to complete each assignment. In addition, so each assignment will have a 30% weightage, equal weightage for both the assignments. Then we are going to have a 30% weightage for an online seminar towards the end of the course. So I'll tell you in a minute what the seminar will be all about, but that's going to have 30% weightage. I will have about 10% weightage for class participation. And this is with regard to, I'll ask you some questions during my talks, and you have to answer them. But you can also ask me questions about what I'm talking about. So that will have 10% weightage. Usually this kind of weightage works very well for in-person classes. I'm not sure how it is going to work online. So if it doesn't work out, and if I feel that it's becoming very, very complicated for me to give you due credit for this, we will just skip it. So that's why I've kept a very low weightage to that. And if that happens, I will just scale up your marks in the assignments and the seminars to make it out of 100. Okay. So assignments gain you the majority of marks. So please spend enough time on them. Some assignment problems will require some small amount of computer scripting, writing code, and also some use of some plotting software to make plots. Okay, so please make sure you are comfortable with some basic computer programming. This is a good time to learn if you have not learned computer programming so far, because later on in your PhD, you will certainly need some kind of computer programming, whatever you do. I strongly recommend Python for your programming. It's a relatively simple language to learn. Even if you are good at programming in other language, I would still say that you consider learning Python because it's a very simple language to learn, particularly if you know programming in Fortran or C or some other language. Within Python, I recommend the NumPy module for fast array computations and the matplotlib for a module for plotting. These are standard modules from within Python. You'll anyway be using them if you're doing any serious numerical programming. Okay, so now about the seminar. The purpose of the seminar is to pick one seminal paper in the field of active galactic nuclei, which you will be expected to explain to the rest of us in about 20 minutes. And each one of us, each one of you will speak about a different paper. So what I will do is very soon I will provide a list of papers to choose from on the course website. I'll provide links to those papers also. So please go through those papers, browse through them, and try and identify the papers that you like. So since we have about 16, 17 participants in this course, I will put up a slightly longer list. I'll put up maybe 25 to 30 papers so that there's no real conflict. Usually there is no conflict But if there is, we'll have to work out a way of resolving it, possibly by adding some papers that are very similar to the paper that is being sought after by multiple people. Okay. The seminars will be held towards the end of the course. So we will need almost a full day for the seminars. So please keep that in mind, but there is no final exam or any midterm exam. So you don't have to worry about exams. This seminar is the only thing that you will have to prepare for. So here's the official syllabus for this course. It starts off with phenomenology of various kinds of active galactic nuclei, Seyfert galaxies, quasars, radio galaxies, liners, BL-lacs, etc. And with a broad survey of continuum, emission, and absorption features of the spectra of the AGN. The spectra of AGN, it turns out, are very rich in the ultraviolet and optical bands, and less so less rich in lines in the other bands. So our analysis will focus on mostly on the UV and optical spectra. Then a little bit about what powers the AGN, the black hole and the accretion disk models for AGN. And then what happens in the regions immediately surrounding the black hole, which are these so-called emission line regions, which come in two flavors, broad line regions and narrow line regions, BLR and NLRs for shorts. And then about the transport of energy from the central engine outwards into the ISM and into the IGM, which is primarily happens through jets and these large radio lobes. So the physics of jets and hotspots will also be part of this course. So I will cover all of these topics, but I will also go a little bit beyond to talk about the connection between the AGN phenomenon and galaxy evolution, because that is a very active area of research today, and I thought I should devote some attention to that topic. I will naturally focus more on areas that are being worked upon at NCRA and IUCAA. But the nature of this course is, one must remember, is largely phenomenological. It's going to be a fairly descriptive course, but I will try to, from time to time, give you the big picture so that you're not lost in the details. So what are the connections to other astronomy courses you have taken or other courses you have taken in the graduate school? There are obviously connections to galaxies, electrodynamics and radiative processes. I think one in the first course that you took, which talked about various kinds of thermal and non-thermal radiative mechanisms, those will all be important for the AGN phenomenon. Of course, GR and SR are important. I will not be focusing too much on the GR aspects of AGN for two reasons. One is that you're expected to have covered some of these things in your GR course, and also I am not a great expert on GR. But of course, SR will figure, because there are things, phenomena like superluminal motion in AGN jets, where SR, special relativity, comes into the picture. So I will talk a bit about that. There is obviously going to be a connection between the course that you are taking right now on the interstellar medium and the intergalactic medium. So watch out for connections between what I say and what is you are learning simultaneously in that course. Radio AGN are, the radio band is a very important band for studying AGN, and therefore radio techniques, which again you are learning about simultaneously with this course, will also come into the picture when we talk about imaging of extended sources, the giant radio galaxies and so on. Textbooks and reference material. I have put up, in fact, the list of some textbooks. I will also add some review articles on the website so that you're able to sort of get the big picture. What I found was, very interestingly, that when I looked up the list of textbooks that are being used currently, I found that many of those textbooks are from 20-25 years ago when I was a PhD student. So there hasn't been much, very many new textbooks that have been written in the last 20 years. However, there are a large number of review articles, because there are a large number of papers that have been written about AGN, and therefore there are a large number of review articles that have been written. So there will be links to those also on the website. I'm putting in a fair bit of effort to make slides for these talks. So please use these as your starting point. And remember to stop me and ask questions if you don't understand something at some point. Okay, don't wait till the end of the lecture. I must also say that there are many aspects of AGN that I have never worked on. So I'm also sort of learning along with you. So hopefully, so if I can't give you an answer to a question immediately, I will definitely research it and get back to you in the next class. Some of the slides that I will show you will cite papers which you are encouraged to read to know more. And this could be quite important for this course because, as I said, there's a lot of papers, research papers that have been written in the last 60 years of AGN studies. And the literature is really, really very vast. So you may have to do some reading of those papers as well. Again, just to reiterate, I've listed already about 5 or 6 textbooks. These are large textbooks. Together, they're probably about 1,500 pages or so. You're obviously not expected to read all of those. So use them as reference material because this is a short course. It's a 14 lecture course. A full course on AGN can be 40-45 lectures. So we are not going to do that. We are just going to do a quick overview. So read in parts that you don't understand or you need more clarity. And of course, if you in the future, if you decide to do your PhD in this field, then of course you will need to read a lot of textbooks and review articles. So are there any questions about how the course is organized and the course content? If you have any questions, please unmute yourself. Okay, so I assume there are no questions. Again, of course, at any point, if you have any doubts, you can ask me during the lecture or just send me an email and I'll answer your question. Okay, so let's begin. So if you look at the light from a normal galaxy, by normal galaxy, I mean a galaxy that does not host an active galactic nucleus. And if you look at these galaxies in the optical and infrared bands, the light from such normal galaxies will be dominated by the light from stars, with smaller contributions coming from gas, usually from ionized gas, and from dust. And the contribution from dust is mainly coming due to absorption. The radiation from stars, as you know, is largely thermal. The emission from stars can be well modeled by a black body function by the Planck spectrum. Whereas the spectrum of a galaxy is therefore described very well by the linear superposition of many billions of blackbody spectra, okay, with temperatures spanning about a dex. So if you take the coolest star, the surface temperature of the coolest star and the surface temperature of the hottest star that can exist, it spans one order of magnitude, not more than that. And so what you will have as a spectrum of a galaxy will be the superposition of many stars at different temperatures, each with its own slightly different blackbody spectrum. The spectrum of the galaxy is, of course, modulated by dust. So what dust tends to do is that it tends to absorb the radiation, particularly the higher energy radiation like the UV radiation, and it tends to get heated by that, by absorbing the photons, and then it tends to re-emit that radiation, and mostly in the infrared. But if you look at AGN, the light from AGN is a mix of both thermal and non-thermal processes. Okay, so this is the key takeaway from this slide, is that unlike galaxies, normal galaxies where the light is dominated by thermal processes, the source of light in AGN is both thermal and non-thermal in nature. So this is a picture of the optical sky. This is the this is in galactic coordinates. So the disk of the Milky Way is sort of along the, of course, along the galactic equator. And as you can imagine, the light from in the optical band is dominated by light coming from stars, from ionized gas, and from dust, which is seen mainly in the form of absorption in the optical. If you want to see dust in emission, you have to go to the infrared bands. On the other hand, if you look at the radio sky, which is shown here again in galactic coordinates. So the brightest part of the radio sky is still the disk of the Milky Way, but the individual sources come from pulsars, from supernova remnants, from star-forming regions within the Milky Way, and from galaxies AGN, which are lying outside the Milky Way. So if you can see my cursor, you'll be able to see a galaxy over here. So that's an AGN, okay, most likely Centaurus A. And you can also see at the center of our galaxy, there is a supermassive black hole. There is a fairly bright radio source over there, which is referred to as Sagittarius A star. Sagittarius because it's in the Sagittarius constellation, and A star, A because it's the brightest source in the constellation of Sagittarius, brightest radio source, and star indicates that it's a point-like object. It's not resolved, and that's because it's really coming from a region very close to the black hole. So our galaxy, you may think, is therefore an AGN, but it's not, because the black hole that is sitting at the center of our galaxy is at the moment quiescent. It's not doing anything. It's just sitting there quietly. But at some point in the future, it may get activated and it may turn into an AGN. And it is also believed that at some points, at numerous times in the past, the Milky Way galaxy was an AGN. Okay, so now the study of AGN began in earnest with the discovery of radio sources, bright radio sources in the sky, a number of which turned out to be AGN. So what is shown here now in equatorial coordinates rather than galactic coordinates. So here you can see the plane of the Milky Way, and shown in these red and blue contours are individual radio sources. Okay, so for example, Orion A and B are a star-forming region. This one is the Crab Nebula in Taurus, which is a supernova remnant. And but you also have a few AGN here. Centaurus A is an AGN. Sagittarius A star, as we already saw, is some kind of quiescent AGN. Cygnus A that you see here is an AGN, and so on. Okay, there are a few of the other objects. Cassiopeia A is a supernova remnant. It's not an AGN. So M87, which you see here at top right corner, is also an AGN. So clearly, if you make a list of, let's say, the 10, 20 brightest radio sources in the sky, about 4, 5, or 6 of them will turn out to be AGN.
Hello, sir.
Yeah.
Sir, do the contoured lines over there represent the flux density in radio band?
Yes. So these are represent the flux density in the radio band. And what is actually shown here in parentheses is the flux of the radio source in Jansky. So for example, in Cygnus A, you will see its 3C designation. That's a number in a catalog. And 1495 indicates that it's a 1495 Jansky source. Okay. And that makes it a really, really bright source. Similarly, Sagittarius A is 1800 Jansky. These are very, very bright sources. The dominant, other than the sun, these are amongst the brightest sources in the radio sky.
Sir,
yeah.
Another thing is that, so like you said the term radio sky. So when we say radio sky, which wave band or which wavelength band do we consider?
Yes. So most of when I talk about the radio, so when I talk in detail about the radio AGN, I will of course describe that. But when I say radio band, I'm primarily meaning frequencies between, say, about 150 megahertz to about 10 gigahertz. Okay, this is what I normally mean, because if you go to higher frequencies, there also that goes into what is called as that is usually referred to as the sub-millimeter and the millimeter bands. Okay, which goes into many hundreds of gigahertz. But the classical radio bands are between 150 megahertz to about 10, 15 gigahertz. And the GMRT telescope, for example, covers a subset of this radio band. It goes from about 150 megahertz to about 1.5 gigahertz.
Thank you, sir.
So what are AGN? So very simply, AGN are galaxies that have a strong emission component emanating from their nuclear region. So there is a lot of light that is coming from their nuclear regions. This additional component is now universally accepted to be caused by an actively accreting central supermassive black hole. Okay, and how massive can that black hole be? It's usually more than 10⁶ solar masses. The mass of the supermassive black hole, this is a typo here, it should be 6 times 10⁻10 solar masses. So that's the mass of the most massive supermassive black hole known. So very roughly, I mean, if you would just want a ballpark figure to remember, remember that the masses of supermassive black holes are between 10⁶ to 10⁹ solar masses. The higher solar mass, the higher mass black holes have not been confirmed. Their mass measurements are not very robust. So you should take those measurements with a pinch of salt. AGN have very high luminosities. Bolometric luminosities can go up to 10⁻48 ergs per second, which means that the most luminous AGN can easily outshine an entire galaxy. Okay. As we shall see, this is very remarkable because the volume that contains the AGN is a very, very tiny fraction of the total volume of a galaxy. So one is seeing light equivalent to a whole galaxy coming from a very tiny volume. These emitting regions are very small in most bands. So except for the radio band where you see very, very extended manifestations of the active galactic nucleus, in most cases, what you see as emission in most of the other bands, like the optical band or the X-ray band, the emission that you see from AGN is coming from a very, very tiny region of the order of a milliparsec. We know by studying AGN at different redshifts that there is strong evolution of the luminosity functions of the AGN with time. So this is a very important consideration, because we know that, for example, that about 5 gigayears, 6 gigayears, 10 gigayears in the past, the very large fraction of galaxies hosted AGN. So that is referred to as the star forming epoch and also as the EGN epoch, because a lot of star formation was happening and there were many AGNs that were providing feedback in the universe. We don't have so many AGN now in the local universe, so that there is evidence for very strong evolution of the luminosity function. The broadband emission from AGN covers the entire electromagnetic spectrum. So that is quite remarkable, that you can see very often the same object can be detected all the way from gamma rays to the radio and all intermediate bands like the infrared, the optical, the ultraviolet, and so on. So that makes AGN a very, very interesting field of study, because you can study AGN with a large variety of telescopes. But what that leads to, because these AGN can be detected and studied at all wavelengths, at all wave bands, the same AGN may receive multiple classifications. So the same object may be called by different names by, say, X-ray astronomers and radio astronomers. So these listed here in this table are the main classes of AGN. Okay, that one must remember here that these are just the sort of broad classes as we understand them today. There are many subclasses within the AGN. Okay, so for example, amongst quasars, there is a large population that has been detected now, or that has been identified using their optical properties. In the old days, quasars referred to as strictly to quasi-stellar radio source. And now many quasars, in fact, 90% of quasars are quite quiet in the radio. You need very, very sensitive radio observations to even detect them. There are, of course, large number of quasars, but a small fraction, about 10%, which are what are called radio loud, which can be detected in the radio quite easily. There are Seyfert-1 and Seyfert-2 galaxies. There are quasi-stellar non-quasar-like objects. QSOs is what they're referred to in the literature. These are non-radio sources. And then there are radio quiet AGNs and radio loud AGNs, AGNs with strong relativistic jets, and non-jetted AGNs without any strong relativistic jets. There are different classes of radio galaxies, Fanneroff-Rayleigh class 1 and Fanneroff-Rayleigh class 2. And then there are beamed objects, BL-lacs and blazars, where relativistic beaming leads to leads to rapid changes in the flux that we observe from these objects. So these are seemingly very, very different objects, but as one shall see later on in this course, there is a unification model which works reasonably well in and gives us an opportunity to think of all of these objects in the AGN zoo as different manifestations of the same underlying physical phenomenon. Okay.
Sir?
Yeah. Go ahead.
When we are saying AGN, are we referring to the emitting nuclear part or to the entire galaxy?
For most of this course, when I say AGN, it will refer to the central regions only, right? But I mean, if you say a galaxy is an AGN, that word is, I mean, that phraseology is often used. There you say it means, there you take it to mean the whole galaxy. So because the impact of the AGN is felt maximally only in the central regions, we will talk mostly about the central regions. But in some cases, especially when we go to impact of AGN on galaxy evolution, there we will have to consider the whole galaxy as the AGN. Yeah. Okay. So a bit through the history of AGN. I'm not going to talk too much about the history, but it's useful to give a quick introduction. So as early as 1908, when the first spectrographs were being used to obtain spectra of galaxies, people like Slipher and others had found that there are very tiny number of galaxies which seem to show strong emission lines in their spectrum. Normally, if you take a normal galaxy, which is, as we saw, a superposition of many stellar spectra, so stellar spectra of the sun, for example, will not show emission lines. It will show lots of absorption lines, primarily from the various hydrogen transitions of the hydrogen atom, which we know as Fraunhofer lines in the solar spectrum. So these are absorption lines. So normally, for most normal galaxies, you don't see emission lines. You see only absorption lines. But what was found by Slipher and collaborators is that there are a few galaxies that show emission lines. And these emission lines, strangely enough, would be coming only from the nuclear regions of the galaxy. These kind of strong emission lines were not seen from the outer parts of the galaxy, only from the central regions. And that too, for a very small fraction of galaxies, you could see these kind of strong emission lines. Of course, this matter was not studied in any great detail until the 1940s, when Carl Seyfert, who was an astronomer, went and studied systematically, went looking for these galaxies with strong emission lines and studied their spectra. And so therefore, in his honor, these kind of galaxies are called Seyfert galaxies today. Carl Seyfert found that these kind of galaxies were invariably hosted by spiral galaxies. So these were not sitting in ellipticals, but these were sitting in spiral galaxies. And he had to search through about 100 galaxies before he found one galaxy which showed emission lines. So he was able to show that, yes, many spiral galaxies, or 1% of spiral galaxies show emission lines of this nature. In addition to these broad emission lines, there were also narrow emission lines. So as you can see over here, there's a very broad emission line. And over here, there is a fairly narrow emission line. So there were, in addition to broad emission lines, there were also narrow emission lines. And these were invariably characterized by a very blue continuum in the ultraviolet. So if you look at the continuum, you can see that as you go below 4000 angstroms, shorter wavelengths, the flux goes on increasing. The continuum flux goes on increasing. And this is also pretty unusual because most galaxies don't show a spectrum like that. Most galaxies will show a slope in the opposite direction, where their UV flux will be considerably lower than, say, their U band or B band flux. This was not seen in most of the AGNs that Seifert studied. So he classified these AGNs as peculiar objects. But again, nobody went into the details of trying to explain the physics of this. Until the late 1950s, when Ludwig Volcher wrote a very interesting paper where he tried to analyze the physics of the Seifert phenomenon. One thing he knew was that these nuclei were unresolved, even with the best telescopes. So the size of the nucleus must be less than about 100 parsec in size. So these strong emission lines, etc., were coming from a region which was less than 100 parsecs in diameter. He could also conclude that the nuclear emission must last more than 10⁸ years, because Seifert galaxies were known to constitute about 1 in 100 spiral galaxies. So one extreme scenario was that galaxies which are Seiferts ones are always Seiferts, in which their lifetime will be the age of the universe, 10⁻10 years. You can take the opposite extreme, is that all spirals pass through a Seifert phase or multiple phases. But since one spiral in 100 is currently in the Seifert phase, it must have a duty cycle of 1 in 100. So therefore, it must last of the order of 10⁻10 over 100, 10⁸8 years. Okay, so that was the idea, that you must have something, even if it recurs, it should have lifetime that is of order of 10⁸8 years. Right, but therein lies a problem, because if the material in the nucleus is gravitationally bound, then you can use the Virial theorem to compute the mass of the nucleus, right? And which will be basically V square R over G, where V is measured by the width of the emission lines that you see coming from the nucleus, right? And R, of course, is the region from which the emission is coming. So that much mass must be sitting inside that volume. Velocity dispersion is of the order of 1000 kilometers per second. This was measured from the spectra of Seifert galaxies that were obtained. We know from the fact that the nucleus is unresolved that it can't be bigger than 100 parsec, because if it were, we would be able to resolve it. The emission lines were characteristic of a low density gas, which effectively provides a lower limit of 1 parsec. Now, this was what was written in this 1959 paper. So this is not strictly correct, because as we know today, the size of the AGN is really much smaller than a parsec in most of the cases. So it is possible to have low density gas. Okay. Why do we need low density gas? Any ideas? Why can't you see emission lines from high density gas? Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
Sir, in the low density gas, in the high density gas, the emission lines which will be originating from the gas will be reabsorbed due to very high optical depth. But in case of low density gas, it will be able to escape from the gas, I guess.
Yes, that is absolutely right. So in the optical depth of high density gas is sufficiently high that even if emission happens, it gets absorbed. Okay, because the optical depth is very high. That is why we cannot see emission lines on the solar spectrum, because there are definitely emission being produced, transition happening in the inner parts of the sun. But because the optical depth is high, you cannot penetrate, you cannot see those atoms transitioning. So therefore, you only see absorption lines which are coming from the outer cooler layers of the stellar atmospheres. And the same phenomenon is expected to happen here. The fact that you see strong emission lines which are reaching up to you indicates that they must be coming from a low optical depth region of the AGN. Okay. Right. So now if you plug in using the Virial theorem, the radius to be either 1 parsec or 100 parsec, put in that as the value of R, and put in 1000 kilometers per second as the value of V in this Virial equation, V square R over G, you will get a mass of 10 raised to 9 plus minus 1 solar masses for the mass that is sitting within that 1 parsec or 100 parsec region. So why do you think this poses a problem?
Hello, sir.
Yeah.
Sir, I guess this is a problem because in our galaxy we said we see the stars which are basically 1 parsec apart.
Yes.
So in the 1 parsec region there could be only one star, but if we are saying that the emitting region is of the scale of 1 parsec,
yeah,
but it is having the mass of 10 to the power 10 stars, which is not usual.
Correct. Yes, it is very difficult to think of stars that are stable. See, remember, it's not just enough to put stars, 10 raised to 8 stars into that volume. Okay, they also have to last for 10 raised to 8 years, right? They cannot disrupt each other, they cannot merge with each other, nothing. So that poses a problem. So the size, packing in so many things can be a problem. What if I say it's not 1 parsec, it is 100 parsec? Then you have a much larger volume to work with, right? Do you think that would be feasible to pack everything into 100 parsec? Anyone else other than Manish? Any thoughts? Can you put? So now how much mass do you need to put? Remember, your R has increased. So instead of 1, it is 100. So M is also going to become 100 times larger. So it is going to go like 10 raised to 10. Is there a problem putting 10 raised to 10 solar masses in within 100 parsec? What is the typical stellar mass of a galaxy? How many stars does it contain?
It's almost like mass of galaxy.
Yes. It's almost like, even if you take a big galaxy like Milky Way, which is 10 raised to 11 stars, right? You are saying you are going to pack the mass of 10% of the stars within that volume. That seems like a problem. Okay, so obviously it became clear that this has to be resolved in some way. Okay, could this be a completely different phenomenon? We are not packing in stars, but we are packing in something else. Now, soon after this paper was written, we had the discovery of quasars by this man you see pictured here as an older gentleman, Martin Schmidt. And on the cover of Time, when he was quite young many years ago, soon after his discovery of quasars. So what Martin Schmidt was doing was he was using the 5-meter telescope at Palomar, and he was obtaining spectra of various objects. And he, at that time, the first radio surveys had become available. So there was the first Cambridge survey, the second Cambridge survey, and so on, made at Cambridge, England. So the third Cambridge survey came up with a list of radio sources that they had detected in the sky. And then by using the positions of those radio sources, Martin Schmidt first identified each object with an optical source. And for this particular radio source, 3C273, he identified with this star-like object. So he was immediately interested. Wow, how can a star emit so much of radio emission? Let me go and check. Since he had access to the biggest optical telescope at that time, he went and obtained a spectrum of this particular star-like object. And that spectrum is shown here. Okay, it's not a very good quality scan because this is from a very old photographic plate. But what he was able to see were various emission lines, right? Which are seen here in black. And then but when he tried to match those emission lines, first of all, he said, why are there so many emission lines rather than absorption lines? And secondly, he couldn't match the spectrum with the spectrum of any known star. It seemed really odd. Not a single line was matching. And then in a moment of inspiration, he said, oh my God, these might be Doppler shifted lines. And then he went and obtained, he started redshifting those lines, started redshifting his lab spectrum to match the lines. And then at a redshift of 0.16, he suddenly discovered that he's getting a perfect match. And this was a very sensational discovery, and that was the discovery of quasars. And that is why he landed up on the cover of Time magazine. And he found that for the first time that there was an object that was very, very distant. Because it was very distant and its flux was relatively low, it must be also very luminous. He measured, of course, its radioluminosity, which was very high. He went and measured its optical luminosity, which was also very high. And he very soon they obtained measurements at a variety of wavebands, and they found that this object was very, very bright at across all wavebands. Very soon after Martin Schmidt's discovery, it was realized that 3C273 is not a unique object. There are many, many other sources in the sky which optically appear like a point source, but in the radio, they're fairly bright. And they are, so the way quasars were discovered, the discovery mechanism was very simple. Find a bright radio source, find positionally its optical counterpart, check whether the optical counterpart is star-like, check its color. They very quickly realized that the optical counterpart would invariably be quite blue in color compared to the stars around it. So it looked like a very blue star. Then go and get a spectrum, find its redshift. And so using this sort of technique, many quasars were discovered. Of course, in the years to come, people realized that you don't have to have that requirement of a radio source. You can just look at point-like radio source, point-like optical object, star-like optical object, which is very blue in color, and just go and get its spectrum anyway. And you'll discover quasars, which are not necessarily bright in the radio. So those are the so-called QSOs, which we will talk about. Okay, so before we end, I'll just cover one topic and we will stop, which is the setting of the AGN size scale, right? So if you look at AGN, how big are they? We've already said that AGNs have a supermassive black hole at their center, which is between 10⁻⁶ and 10⁹ solar masses. So what is the Schwarzschild radius of such a black hole? What is the Schwarzschild radius of the sun? Does anyone know?
Around 2-3 meters.
Sorry?
Around 2-3 meters.
No, that is too small. It's actually 3 kilometers.
Okay.
Okay. 3 kilometers. So what will be the radius of 10⁶ solar mass black hole, Schwarzschild radius?
3 into 10 to the power 6.
Yes, because remember the Schwarzschild radius is given by 2gm/c square, right? So it's the radius is directly proportional to the mass. So it will be 1,000,000 times larger. And what about 10⁹ solar mass black hole?
3 into 10 to the power 9.
Correct. So that is about 3 billion kilometers. So now if you compare that with, think of this in astronomical units, astronomical unit, remember, is the average distance between the Earth and the Sun. It is about 150 million kilometers. So 3 million kilometers will be much smaller than the Earth-Sun distance. And 3 billion kilometers will be about maybe 20 times larger than the Earth-Sun distance. So again, we are talking of sizes that are of the Schwarzschild radius of the AGN at the center of the black hole at the center of AGNs is only about the size of the solar system. It's not very large. Even for the most massive supermassive black holes, the Schwarzschild radius is of the order of the solar system. Maybe a little bit larger, but not by much. Okay. So we will stop here. So if there are any questions based on what all I have said today, please ask. Yeah, so if there are no questions, we will break now and we will meet again at 11:30 on Wednesday. Please note that I want to try and finish the lectures relatively quickly because I have to attend a couple of conferences in June for which I'll be busy. So I'm going to try and finish my lectures by the 5th of June. So although this is a 14 lecture course, I'm going to try and finish it in about 5 weeks instead of the usual 7 weeks. So I will see you again on Wednesday at the same time, 11:30. Thank you.